Good evening, welcome. My name is Joanna King, and I am part of the program team here at the American Academy in Berlin. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Bertolt Beitz lecture, Pockets of Restraint in Violent Security Forces, delivered by Sabrina Karim. We're very happy to have Sabrina with us as this semester's Bertolt Beitz Fellow. I want to wish an especially warm welcome to our trustees in the room this evening, former Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to the United States, Emily Haber, and Christine Wallich, former World Bank Director. And a warm welcome to the representatives from Germany's Federal Foreign Office and Defense Ministry. Thank you for being here tonight. I'd like to say a few words about the fellowship which has made tonight's event possible. The Bertolt Beitz Fellowship is one of the newest additions to the roster of American Academy Fellowships, generously supported by the Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach Foundation, which has funded initiatives in arts, culture, education, science, and health since 1968. Named after Bertolt Beitz, a leading business figure of his time, the fellowship honors a life marked by both professional achievement and moral courage. Born in Vorpommern during World War I, Beitz began his career in banking before moving to Hamburg to work for Renania Ossag, a predecessor of Shell Deutschland. During World War II, while overseeing oil operations in Poland, he saved numerous Jewish employees from deportation. After the war, he became Director General of Iduna Germania, where he met Alfred Krupp, who later anointed him as a key advisor and general representative of the Krupp Corporation. Beitz went on to serve as chairman of the board and later honorary chairman, playing a central role in transforming Krupp's private assets into a foundation he led from 1967. Beitz died in 2013, leaving a lasting legacy in Germany's post-war economic development and Ostpolitik. His contributions are commemorated through various honors and continue today through the Bertolt Beitz Fellowship at the American Academy in Berlin. We're happy that Sabrina was able to travel to Essen earlier this semester, where she held the Bertolt Beitz lecture, The Future of United Nations Peacekeeping, in the beautiful Villa Hügge, where the Krupp family resided. And we are delighted to have you, Sabrina, as our second Bertolt Beitz Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. We often have Berlin-based colleagues or friends of our fellows do the honors of introducing our fellows. So tonight, I have the honor of introducing our introducer, McCartan Humphreys, who will introduce Sabrina. McCartan Humphreys directs the Institutions and Political Inequality Group at the WZB, Berlin's Social Science Center, and holds honorary professorships in political science, economics, and social sciences at Humboldt University and Trinity College Dublin. He holds a PhD in political science from Harvard University, an MPhil in economics from Oxford University, and a BA in history and political science from Trinity College Dublin. Professor Humphreys has authored and co-authored several books on ethnic politics, natural resource management, game theory and politics, and research design. A former Trudeau Fellow, Harvard Academy Scholar, and Executive Director of the Evidence in Governments and Politics Network, McCartan is Secretary of the European Political Science Society and an Associate Editor of the American Political Science Review. Thank you, Professor Humphreys, for being here tonight and taking on this role. Before I invite him up to the lectern, let me briefly outline the format of tonight's event. Sabrina will talk for about 40 minutes, after which we will open up the discussion to you, the audience in the room, as well as guests who are joining us virtually. If you are with us here at the Academy, please raise your hand and we will come to you with a microphone. And please make sure your question is indeed a question. And if you are joining us online, you can type your question in the Q&A box below after accepting the pop-up. And now, Professor Humphreys, the floor is yours.
Great. So it's a huge pleasure to introduce Sabrina Karim. I was thinking how to go about doing this, and these introductions are classically sometimes a little boring, where you go through the list of all of the achievements, and the achievements are incredible at this stage. I started looking at the set of publications in all of the top journals. If you don't know the field, American political science review, all top journals in international relations, top journals in development. And then I wrote to Sabrina earlier today and said, could you send me a few more of these articles that I haven't seen? And she followed back with an email with 15 more articles and another book that I didn't know about. So extraordinary creativity and all kinds of prizes and all that. But instead of focusing on that, what I want to do, especially for people who aren't really aware, know this field very well, is try and characterize a little bit some of what's really special about Sabrina's work. And it really is special. We have a gem here. And so we'll do this in the form of bingo. So I'm going to give a few characteristics, and then maybe during the talk you can see how many of these characteristics you see advertised during these talks. But one I think feature of the work is Sabrina has been just opening up new research areas, new research spaces. So she's done the very rare thing in our field to lay claim to a cohesive, important agenda, and to open up for other researchers to start working on this. I think you've really pushed this agenda very far forward in terms of bringing this, thinking about the role of gender and gender politics into the security field in a way that hasn't been done in research so well before, and so in an extraordinary way. I think worth pointing out, the second characteristic is the way this has been done. This is an area where it's very easy to focus primarily on very conceptually heavy aspects of the work. I think something particularly about Sabrina as that she's made these questions extremely concrete questions. These are all she turns these into real vital questions that matter for policy, that matter for thinking, that you can go out and you can see, am I right about this? In an area where people might have very strong views. And in my reading of the work, often it results in surprising findings. We'll see if that's true of the work today. But it means having to sometimes find that the world isn't agreeing with what you're expecting it to produce as findings, and that's something that is very, very powerful in this work. A third feature is that she brings a very theoretically strong picture to what she's doing. And in particular, and I think we'll see that today, she manages to engage both in thinking through the individual choices, individual agency, and then the institutional components that are shaping these choices, and getting those two things going and interacting at the same time. And that's extremely hard to do, working with agency and constraint. And so that's something I think we'll see today. The fourth feature, which I love about this work, is that she is absolutely open to method. She's using some of the best, most difficult methods, but a huge range of methods. And so it's a case where the research agenda is driven primarily by questions, by big questions, and then a willingness to use whatever method she needs, or whatever method is going to help her get answers there. So that ranges from experiments to interviews to focus groups to cross-country work to comparing lots of cases, lots of countries around the world, and lots of people within particular cases. Just extraordinary. And then the last thing I just want to focus on, which I think you'll see also, and it's I think something of a lesson for us in social science research in Germany, is how much her work is really concrete and field-based. How she's engaging directly with the actors that can be most informative about what she's doing, but with whom she can learn together. And so a lot of this work is based on these long-standing developed partnerships with key actors in country. And it's extraordinary. It's inspiring to see all this coming together. So those are a set of things to look out for as we're watching this. Bottom line, this is work that matters. It's work that's well done, and it's a privilege to be able to follow it. Thank you.
So I just learned that one can move this down. So this is very exciting. usually I'm a short person, so usually it's much higher. So this is very exciting. But thank you, McCartan, for this generous introduction. It's not every day that I get to be introduced by somebody that I've looked up to my entire career. So usually it's the other way around. I'd be introducing you. So thank you so much. Before I begin, I do need to take a moment to thank several people, so please bear with me. First, my sincere thank you to Dan Benjamin and the American Academy. I am here, as many of you know, with my 4-year-old and my 1-year-old, Ansel and Ewan. And so I can't imagine that our needs here at the Academy have always been easy. So I am especially grateful to the staff, Gabby, Paolo, Toby, Stefan, Ralph, Joanna, Joanna, Julian, Francis, Victor, Axel, Caroline, Denise, Margaret, Yanina, Rita. Gabby always asks us if we feel at home, and I can confidently say, because of all of you and others that were not on this list, but that we have felt more than at home. We have truly felt a part of this family. I'm also incredibly fortunate to spend this time with such a remarkable cohort of fellows. Your conversations have inspired me, broadened my thinking in ways intellectual and personal, and made each day richer. I will miss our breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, but perhaps more than me, my son will miss them, my son Ansel. And thank you to the fellows for indulging his endless curiosity. And one day I'm so excited to tell both you and Ansel that they ate breakfast next to MacArthur Fellows, interviewed former leaders of the CDC, and chatted up, and I really mean chatted up, world-renowned scholars, journalists, musicians, artists, and curators. And last but not least, I need to thank my wonderful husband, Josh, who has made all of this possible for me. He has cared for Ansel and Ewan throughout our stay and created the space for me to think, read, and write. And obviously to my children, Ansel and Ewan, thank you for your patience while your mom has been quite preoccupied thinking. So with that, let me begin my talk today. And thank you to the audience for coming today for this talk. This is a book project that is at the beginning stages, but something that I've been thinking about for years. I've been collecting data, as McCartan mentioned, all different kinds of data for years. I've had these ideas in my head, but being here this semester, I've been able to start to put these puzzle pieces together. So this is preliminary theorization. What I'm thinking about now is splitting the book into 3 parts. One part will be on authoritarian regimes, which is what you'll be seeing today. So this is kind of a hard case in political science where we're least likely to see restraint in these kinds of situations. But I'm also hoping to look in hybrid post-conflict contexts where we see restraint, and then in democracies. We had a very inspiring lecture by Sherry Lynn Iffel earlier this semester, which really got me thinking about restraint in democracies. Okay, so let me just begin. So when we usually think of the police or of protests, I think oftentimes we think of these kinds of images. These are newspaper clippings, so police or military response in places like Bangladesh, France, which has one of the most violent police forces in Europe, Kenya, US, and Brazil. And I think our news media and our feeds, our social media feeds are often really, these are the kinds of pictures that we see and I think maybe that we think of. So one of the first questions that I wanted to ask is just how common is this kind of a response? And so I, several years ago, had a National Science Foundation career grant to start collecting data on all protests since the 1970s and to then code police response and then, in more fancy terms, train AI to help me with that. Unfortunately, I think this has been said quite a bit that grant was taken away as a part of the Doge cuts last year. But I am still working on this, and I'm happy that I'm able to show you at least something preliminary today, which is this figure. And I do apologize, there will be several figures in this presentation. So what we have here is just kind of a random sample of protest articles in the media about protest over time since the 1970s. The black we've coded as where there was violence, and then the red is where there's no reports of violence. And the big takeaway that I want you to when you see this is that there's a lot of red. We should be happy that there's a lot of red. Right? This is suggesting that maybe most response to protest is not violent. Okay. So if that's the case, then I wanted to start with this question. And the question is, why do armed agents of the state sometimes choose not to use the violence that is available to them? And this is a kind of a dog that didn't bark question. It's kind of studying this phenomenon in the opposite, because like I just showed you, the news is inundated with these, and the reports that we hear are inundated with violence, but we very rarely hear about the nonviolence. And so it's really hard to study something that's less observable, that we don't observe in the real world. And so it's a more difficult question. Like all good political scientists, I do start out with a definition, and this took me some time to come to, but it's this, which is not restraint. In how I'm conceptualizing it is the deliberate non-use, underuse, or bounded use of coercive authority, despite the capability, opportunity, and often organizational permission or pressure or even demand to use more. This is a different concept than what others have written about recently. So here, I think it's important to point out that books by Zoltan Barany. There's a really great book that just came out called The Dictator's Endgame by Aurel Crescent, David Kuhn, and Tanya Engler. Sharon Nepstead has also written a lot about nonviolent revolution. All of these books look at the military, first of all. And second of all of them are looking at defection, or when there's side switching, when the military switches from supporting the regime to the other side, to taking the side of the protesters. I'm trying to conceptualize this as much more broadly. It's not just those kinds of defections. And I'm also trying to think of being inclusive of all security forces. So there's been a lot more written on the military and a lot less that's been written about internal security forces or the police on this topic. My starting place in this authoritarian context, like I talked about, is this almost canon in political science now that nonviolent revolution is more likely to succeed when there is security force restraint or defection. Erica Chenoweth is the pioneer on this work, found in her book that there's about a 60% likelihood that a revolution will succeed if the security forces defect. And others that have looked at this more recently almost think that it's a necessary condition for successful a nonviolent revolution. I have looked, so I put together a list of about 160 or 180 kind of successful cases and kind of tried to trace what's going on in them. And I'm going to present 3 today, and they're going to seem very weird. the choices. They're kind of all over the place. But it's to demonstrate key takeaways that I think are important. So the cases are going to be Bangladesh in 2024, the revolution there. Honduras in 2017, which wasn't quite a revolution, but it was an electoral politics kind of crisis situation. And then one that's going to be really close to home here, for many of you, East Germany, Leipzig in 1989. And I hope that you'll see that there's going to be a key takeaway, a lesson learned from each one of these. So I will begin. So in Bangladesh, I was lucky enough to be able to do some original field work with leaders of the social movement there, the student movement that led to the revolution. So we interviewed and did focus groups and surveyed the leaders of the student movement, and also collected original data on the killings. There's a lot of misinformation that was going on during that time, so we wanted an accurate account of just how bad the repression was. So what happened is, just as a refresher for those of you that probably don't remember what happened almost 2 years ago, it all started with the reinstatement of a 30% job quota for the quote-unquote freedom fighters. This was just another way to basically say that all the jobs should go to the party leaders, right? So freedom fighters were basically one and the same as the Awami League, which was the party. And if you're a student looking for a job in the future, this basically guaranteed that you wouldn't necessarily get one unless you were a member of the party or unless you were a party supporter. So what happens is that the protests are small in the beginning, just students. Then in July, mid-July, it turns repressive. There's the killing of a prominent student, Abu Saeed. And then all of a sudden we get a shift in the demand for the protest to one of regime change. Okay. Then there's large-scale protests all over the country that erupt. And quite surprisingly, Sheikh Hasina, who is the prime minister, she flees in dramatic fashion on August 5th. Okay. So how bad was the violence? According to our data, there were 985 people that were killed. We see this in two spurts. So in the beginning here, right after the killing of Abu Said, and then towards the end. Anita, I know you're in the audience, so I put the grayscale for you here of the internet shortage. This is when there's an internet blackout there. So you can see that. So then the question is, who was committing this violence? From our data, the vast majority were the police. So the police killed about 546. This is the Rapid Action Battalion, which is an infamous part of the police, and then the border guards, which is also an internal security force. This is in contrast to the military. Right here, there was repression by the military. They did apparently kill 18 people, but it's this discrepancy that I want to start with, first of all. Now, for many of you, this may make intuitive sense. Well, the military has a different function, right, than the police. They're called in later, those kinds of things. But this is to make an important point that I'm going to get to here in a second. But I want to investigate with you today kind of this difference first. Okay, so how do I do this? I'm going to look. I want us to hear the voices of the student leaders. So this is why I've brought in kind of quotes that from the focus groups that we did. We did 24 of them, like I said, with the leaders. So Maza, if you will, read us our first quote for today.
I mean, the Awami League recruited police from Chhatra League. There was hardly any opportunity for anyone else to enter. So the police became the Awami League's hired muscle. The police were the Awami League's baton-wielding force.
Thank you. So this quote is basically saying that the police were all one and the same as the party. So they were, in order to become a police officer, you had to be a party member. And all of the leadership was controlled by the party. Every single focus group had this to say about the police. So this is going to be different than what was said about the military. So here, Derek.
I think the Army or other forces like the Air Force have recruitment systems where politicization is comparatively lower and recruitment is based more on competence.
Yes. So again, very similar to the police in almost every single focus group, people were able to distinguish this fact that the military was different in this way, that they were less controlled by the government. There was less politicization. You didn't necessarily have to be a party member in order to join the military, right? Okay, and our last quote, Anne.
Another reason was that the Army represents the country in UN peacekeeping missions. Even if the Army wanted to act, there would be accountability. There was a possibility of being removed from those missions. Thinking about this internal pressure, they acted cautiously.
Yeah, so this to me was one of the most interesting things that came out of the focus groups, was the fact that that they thought, and this is kind of confirmed by some people that I know in the military, about their reputation internationally, especially with the United Nations. Bangladesh is one of the top contributors troop contributors to UN peacekeeping operations and has been for decades. And so this repression, carrying out this repression, could jeopardize their position and standing in the UN, such that maybe the UN would not have them deploy anymore, and that would mean less resources, right? So whereas the police very much tied to the regime, the military less so, they are able to be more concerned about their own reputation. And this brings me to the first takeaway and this first kind of political science concept of autonomy, which I think is a really important thing to think about as a first step when we're looking at any security force and thinking about whether they're going to be restrained or not. And I'm using Huntington's definition of autonomy here, which is a political organization that exists independent of the regime. It's the extent to which they have their own interests and values that is distinguishable from the regime. So we know from the quotes that the police are less autonomous. They are more controlled by the Awami League. And what this effectively does is that it means that they have a linked fate to the regime. What happens to the regime happens to the police. So you can even imagine at the individual level, this is true. If I'm a police officer, I'm a party member. If the regime falls, the police falls. right? I lose my job, or worse, somebody comes to get me afterwards, right? So they have to be all in on repression because it's the only way to win out, possibly the only way to win out and survive. And so they're going to fight to the end for that survival. If there is more autonomy, such as the case in the military, the force has, an individual have more discretion in terms of how they're going to act. And they can be concerned, more concerned about their institution, about their organization than the regime. And in fact, more oftentimes they are, right? They are interested in the organization's survival, and it is not dependent on the regime's survival. So even if the regime falls, the military will still be there. And as we know, this means that they might even value their international reputation more so than supporting the regime. Okay, so this is our first key takeaway, this idea of autonomy. Now you might say, well, this is true for, this division is always true. And indeed, we do see, this is why, we had all those books written about the military. Usually there is, by function, more autonomy for militaries than for police forces, but that is not always the case. And I'm going to walk you through the next case, for which there is, these are cases of internal security forces where we do see autonomy as well. And so these cases are being less studied because I think there's this assumption that autonomy is only equivalent for this military police divide. So this very obscure case, but one that is one of my favorites because it actually did the job of making me reverse my question from studying police violence to police restraint. Honduras is a small Latin American country in Central America. And I'm sure maybe somebody knows what happened in 2017, but let me just tell you. So there were fraudulent elections, and Juan Orlando Hernandez is running for a second term despite a constitutional ban. There are elections held, there is a vote count, there's delays, there's allegations of fraud, there's protests. The leaders call out this elite Cobra unit to repress the population. There's a nationwide curfew, and then all of a sudden, the Cobras stop repressing. They barrack, and they say, "We're not going to repress. We're gonna let the protests happen." They're holding hands. They're dancing in the streets. So why? Why did this happen? Okay. So one thought is what the Cobra leader said himself. So this is a quote. He says, this is posted on Facebook. "This is a message for the violence to end. There is no need for people to be in the streets killing each other for something the politicians can resolve among themselves. It is not our job. We are not acting according to any political ideology. This is our feeling. Our call is that all this ends because we are not willing to come to the streets and confront the people or engage or repress the people, crack down on the people." The media loves this. They pick this up, and we see all kinds of reports like the one here of this democratic moment, this operational unit, maybe even this democracy training program by the U.S. or the human rights program by the U.S. was the reason for this moment of democracy, of this non-repression. I'm sorry to say, it is not this fluffy. It is not. This is not a normative thing that happened. It wasn't these norms that were trickled down from the U.S. or, from somewhere. It's a moment of it's a strategic calculation. So, why did they actually refrain from violence? The first thing to note is that they are an autonomous unit. So it's not even just, we're not talking about the force. This is a unit that was created in 1979 with U.S. backing to counter leftist movements, as was the case in many Central American countries where the U.S. provided police assistance to create these kinds of units. So they're concerned about their own survival, right, as an autonomous unit. In 2009, there is a coup, and a rival security force, the military police of the public order, starts to receive significantly more resources and political backing than the Cobras. So they get a little jealous, right? They get a little jealous of the resources and this privileged status that this other force is getting. And so they use the protest as a bargaining chip to negotiate for better pay and better resources. And we know this because 3 days later, they returned to their enforcement and repression after being promised increases in salary and improved living quarters. And so what is necessary for this bargaining to happen is what I want you to understand, is that there has to be some kind of autonomy. That's why I started with autonomy. And effectively what this is a strike that's couched in democratic language. And when I've looked at the 160, 180 cases or so, more often than not, I was disappointed because this is what's going on. There's some kind of strategic element of why there is restraint, and this is coming because the security forces are able to bargain in moments where they can use the protest as a bargaining chip when they know they're losing resources or status. When there is this relative rivalry with other security forces. In Malawi, they use this moment to actually take out an entire security force, a rival security force, after the revolution. It also, if autonomous institutions that we know are concerned about their reputation, they don't want to be associated with the losing side. So if the leader is losing legitimacy, oftentimes after a humiliating military loss, they're going to save their face, right? And they're not going to support the leader. And this is oftentimes when defection happens, where they switch sides because the other side is going to maybe give them a better deal than this losing dictator. Okay. However, that is not always the case. So I'm really excited to talk about this case study of Leipzig. I'm also nervous because I'm not a scholar of European politics or history, nor do I speak German. And there have been dozens of books written on this moment, wonderful books by Karl Dieter Opp, Elizabeth Pond, Wayne Barty, Stephen Paff, Susan Lohmann, and others, and many more in German. But the more I've dug into this case, I've visited Leipzig, I've looked at the archives, it's become really fascinating to me, and because it contradicts everything I've just told you. Okay, so the security forces, first of all, the security forces were not autonomous. Okay, the Stasi, the VP that was infiltrated by the Stasi, the NVA, the military, the workers' militias, they were all a part of the party, right? They're not autonomous. So we don't see any instances of bargaining in this situation. There definitely was relative status, the military was less favored, those kinds of things, but that's not what's happening here. Instead, we have this miraculous moment on October 9th at 6 p.m. where 70 to 166,000 people, I have an asterisk there because Karl Dieter Opp has done some fantastic work showing that 70,000 number that is shown in every museum in Germany is actually wrong. So it was much higher. It was about 26% of the population. So I want to be able to say that in a public space because it's very important. And what happened was all of these security forces, there were 12,000 personnel. They let them march. And so it starts at this church here, and then it spills into the Karl Marx Platz, and then they march around this ring past the Stasi headquarters all the way around. And if you know anything about this moment, it's quite incredible that this happened. Right. Okay. So let me tell you about some key moments leading up to this. First of all, the very last time that there were protests of this scale was in 1953 with the workers' strikes. They were wanting better pay. The Soviets were there with tanks, and it was a massacre. Right? A lot of people were killed. So there were no large-scale protests after that until this moment. The other thing to note is this is the famous church here. There were peace prayer meetings in Leipzig at the St. Nikolai Kirche. Hopefully I said that right, Stephen. These peace meetings that started in 1982, and they started very small, but they start to grow, and by 1989 they become a very important part of the story. In 1986, many of you know that Mikhail Gorbachev implements perestroika and glasnost as reforms in the Soviet Union. They are not adopted here in East Germany. In fact, the leaders were quite against any kind of reform, but they were actually quite popular in East Germany among the citizens. We didn't know, people didn't really know this until afterwards, but the surveys all find that was the case. 1989 starts off with a regular demonstration commemorating Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. I always have a hard time saying that. And this is a protest that's organized by the SED, but it's co-opted by some people that held up a sign about freedom. 53 people are arrested, and it kind of starts off this cycle of protest repression that we see throughout the year. On May 2nd, Hungary demilitarizes the border with Austria, leading to the exodus of many East Germans because of not needing a visa anymore. And it's a crisis for the regime. On May 7th, we, for the first time, and this is, for anybody that's studying politics, this is really incredible. These are all these pictures, or some of these pictures I took, but some of them are pictures of pictures at museums. But this is the handwritten counts of citizen election monitors that found fraud in the May 7th elections and made them public. And this was repressed. I mean, it's immense fraud. In June, there's protests in solidarity with what's happening in China. So we all know about Tiananmen Square. There was environmental action and a street music festival in Leipzig. These were all repressed, 83 people arrested. So we start to see this cycle. There's a summer break from protest. In September, it picks up again. On October 2nd, it's the first time that the meeting, so sorry, I should just say that everybody knew starting in 1982, I had mentioned that these church meetings started. So everybody knew in Leipzig that Mondays at 6 p.m. was a place, this was where you went if you wanted to have a discussion about what was happening. And it was a safe space because it was within the church and the SED had this arrangement. And they start to grow over time. At first, they're all people that are dissent or that are wanting to leave, that have exit visas, but they start to grow, right? So these peace meetings, everybody knows that that's where to go. So on October 2nd, for the first time, these meetings spill into a spontaneous march towards the train station, and they are deterred. So there's repression, they are deterred, and this is the information that the Stasi send back to Berlin. This is actually quite important, that these protests can be contained with X number of police officers, etc. It's really kind of not as big of a threat. So that's an important piece of information. On October 7th and 8th, many of you will know that it was the 40th anniversary of the GDR. There was repression there. But more importantly, perhaps, Mikhail Gorbachev is there, and he tells the leaders that the Soviet tanks won't be there this time if there are protests. This is important. So you can see that there's kind of momentum on the side of the protesters. There is repression happening, and it's all leading up to this day on October 9th. All signs pointed to massive repression on this day. First of all, up here, there was something called the Stasi Preventative Complex Measure, which was plans for the arrest and rapid internment for 86,000 people that were identified by the GDR. In Leipzig, there were 300,000 cards on file of people that they had been watching and 10,000 informants. The leadership, including Egon Krenz, had supported the Chinese solution that summer. They had lauded what the Chinese had done in Tiananmen. There was the mobilization of 12,000 personnel and armored vehicles. The regional People's Army units were put on high alert. There were extra security forces, the helicopter squadron, air attack regiment, mobile police, border troops, and the Kampfgruppen, the party militia. There was extra blood plasma. Beds were distributed to hospitals, and helmets and shields and riot sticks and gas masks and lethal ammunition were distributed to the security forces. And perhaps most ominously, there were all kinds of op-eds, one notorious one in the newspaper. So Stephen.
Wir sind bereit und willens, das von uns mit unserer Händearbeit geschaffene wirksam zu schützen und diese konterrevolutionären Handlungen ein für allemal zu unterbinden, wenn es sein muss, mit der Waffe in der Hand.
Yes, the English translation is here. I hear that it's very powerful in German. So it's no doubt then that Karl Dieter Opp, who does this survey a few weeks after the protests, finds that 70% of the population expected some kind of drastic measure against the demonstrations on October 9th. Okay. So what do I think happened after analyzing all of this? So first of all, I think that so we're in this space where there's no autonomy here with the security forces, but there was some fragmentation in the leadership. So first of all, key leaders were actually ill. So Erich Honecker was ill and had just returned from medical treatment on October 3rd. Horst Schumann, who was the first secretary in Leipzig, also falls ill. Additionally, the Politburo, the party leadership, is really focused on this exodus problem and the 40th anniversary. You know, they have to put up the spectacle in Berlin. And like I said before, the information about Leipzig is presented as containable. They estimated that in Leipzig there may be about 30 political groups, maybe 1,000 people that could be arrested at any moment, right? So it's kind of presented as not as threatening as it was, perhaps. So what happens is that the decision of what to do is left to the regional and local leaders. This is where it gets a little bit murky. There is no direct or indirect or order to repress, but there's not a direct order to not do anything either. We do know that there was a telex kind of message on October 5th to all Stasi officers in regional areas that said that all protests should be decisively thwarted. We also know that there were 2 phone calls on the morning between Erich Mielke and Manfred Humitsch, who is the head of the Stasi in Leipzig, and Erich Mielke was the head of the Stasi. They were also inconclusive about the use of force. So, at the local and regional level, on October 8th, the planning meeting for what to do, the party leaders and the security forces in Leipzig are also divided. The chief of police was perhaps willing to use force. This is from reading some of the readings, and some party members, however, were much more hesitant than the hardliners. So it's this atmosphere of really no direct order, kind of equivocation almost in terms of what to do. So what are the security forces to do if they don't have a direct order about what to do? So here's when the people matter. Kurt Masur, who was the conductor of the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, was a very prominent figure in Leipzig. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about him today in this moment, and the other 6 people here. But I should say that there are a lot of people that were a part of this nonviolent appeal, but also just kind of the nonviolent and the opposition. They weren't really opposition, but the protest side of things, whose names won't be named in this presentation, but it's just worth noting that it was much broader than this, especially by those that were in the churches. They had quite a big role in this. But what happens? Kurt Masur, like I said, is this key figure who's a conductor, which means a lot in Germany. He's very concerned about what's going on because he has to walk across Karl Marx Platz every day to get to the Gewandhaus. And he tells reporters later that I took a break from the best job in the world to do my civic duty. And what was that civic duty? He called Kurt Mayer, who was the district secretary for culture in Leipzig, and everybody could feel that this vibe, something was about to happen. So he calls him up and he says, we need to do something about this because it could get catastrophic. So they have a meeting in his house at 1:30 p.m. on October 9th. They write this appeal. The text is finalized by 4:30. Masur rushes to record it so that it can be played on a loudspeaker. It is read in the churches. It's posted. It's posted here on all around the city, and it works essentially. So I think what's important is for the protesters, Kurt Masur and these other people had a lot of moral persuasion. But I think for the security forces, for the first time, they were able to see that there were party members that had signed off also on this, that gave them maybe almost permission to be more restrained. But I actually think more importantly, this is very important, but also the size of the crowd, which I'll get into here. But I meant to, I wanted Stephen to also read the last sentence of this as well, because it's very powerful also in German, not so much in English, but please go ahead.
Wir bitten Sie dringend Besonnenheit, damit der friedliche Dialog möglich wird.
Yes, a calm reflection so that peaceful dialogue. It's an appeal to the people. Okay, so in this moment, I'm calling this moral restraint. I don't love this term. I think I'm going to change it eventually, but this is kind of what we see. I think there's a need for, in these instances, such as in Leipzig, for there to be some kind of opening, fragmented leadership equivocation. The security forces in this instance were unaccustomed to this kind of discretion. So maybe they're going to side on the air of caution. Now I'm going to use a political science term, which is that I think that the protest reveals information to the security forces. So the security forces, their thought and what they had been told, many of them, and I've read accounts of some of the, some of these security force personnel. They were told that these were going to be rowdy crowds. They were going to be violent, that, they were exiters. Those were people that had exit visas. They were not their neighbors, family and friends. So they're kind of surprised, right? That they're surprised by the size. They're surprised that it's so representative, and they're nonviolent. And so here in these instances, the protesters and protest have agency. The characteristics really matter and can inhibit repression. All right, so I have told you about two different types of restraint: strategic restraint and moral restraint. And this is kind of a newer part of the project where I don't want to just leave it at that, because it's great that we have successful revolution, but what happens after, right? Do we get all of these democratic outcomes that one would hope for after a revolution? And so that's where I kind of want to compare if we see these instances of strategic restraint versus moral restraint. And so I'm proxying strategic restraint with this idea of defection, because when you get defection, you know that there's maybe some kind of bargaining happening because the security forces can play one side off of the other. It is worse for democracy in the long run. So for those of you that want to see the statistics, in here, this is as technical as it's going to get. I have on the y-axis the predicted level of democracy using the varieties of democracy. This is a very simple regression with security force defection as one, other cases is 0. So there's a decline in democracy 3 years later. This is different with these instances of moral restraint, where it's just that the security forces hold back. Right? They're not defecting, and it has no effect on democracy going forward. So it's not good or it's not bad, and in a sense, this makes sense why we might see these poorer outcomes for democracy. Because if you are in this autonomous position to be able to make a king, right? You are a kingmaker because you are deciding who's going to be the next leader, because you're throwing your weight behind that leader, whether it's the opposition or whether it's the incumbent. They kind of owe you one, right? So they're not going to want to reform, and they might thwart democratic reforms because they have just essentially made you the ruler of the country. So they're going to resist any kind of reform. Whereas that's a little bit different, I think, in this other instance. Okay. Last part of the, like 2 slides left, I promise. I really did want to be able to say something about this amazing data that my Gender and Security Sector Lab has been able to collect over the last 8 years or so. And this is at the individual level. We have, the question I'm going to ask here is who holds more restrained attitudes. But we've been able to collect data from personnel thanks to the LC Initiative Fund and DCAF and Global Affairs Canada, in these countries since 2019. So these everywhere from Uruguay to Norway to Ghana, Jordan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Fiji. We did surveys with military personnel, police personnel, or both, with an N of about 6,183 personnel to date. We just had our team come back from Fiji. And I just very quickly want to show you just two things that I think are important when we're thinking about individual level restraint. Okay, and this is me. I promise I was on the ground, like McCartan said. This is a bit dated, but I did want to show you that I'm actually in it. But so the two questions: who is more willing to disobey orders for moral reasons? This is a very important question for what I've just talked about, as well as who is more likely to de-escalate in a crisis situation. There's a lot of findings here, but I've kind of and I've written a lot and I'm publishing a lot on these kinds of questions right now, but I wanted to highlight three things. So personnel who are in the service for personal benefit. So these are people who join because of pay. They don't really believe necessarily in the mission of the police or the military, those kinds of people. Those people that a belief in fairness in decision making. It should actually be that it's so if you think there's more unfairness, you're more likely to disobey. And women. So what matters here is the level of investment in the organization, and this makes sense because one thing I didn't get to go into is conscript armies. So it's the conscripts that are the first to defect and to be restrained, and that is because their level of investment in the organization is less. So all of these findings make sense. Now, you can debate amongst ourselves. We can debate if women have less investment in the military police. I don't necessarily believe that, but it's an interesting point. I think, which is different than what we have for de-escalation. Here, cohesion really matters, as well as women, but better relationships with your superiors, with your commanders. So if you have trust in authority and you trust your leaders, you feel better to be able to de-escalate from a situation, as well as horizontal cohesion. So cohesion with your peers, your relationship with your peers. And then women. I couldn't give this presentation without having some kind of a gender. And I'm not just putting this up because, I study gender, but it's actually a very strong finding. And it's consistent with a lot of other work not done by me. So what matters here, I think, is cohesion and gender. Okay, let me just wrap up very quickly. Again, I'm in the field, I promise. This is in Bangladesh. Okay, autonomous institutions are important. I think when policymakers are and forecasters or journalists or whoever are trying to see if a revolution is going to succeed, we should look first at the level of autonomy that those security forces have. And it might be hard to guess. So I know Iran is on the minds of a lot of people. I think, if I'm briefing intelligence, I would tell them to look at how weak these links are in the leadership, but then also, how much distance do they have from the regime. I just pointed out, though, that this can be very dangerous because autonomous institutions that can bargain can have this king-making power, which can be worse for democracy. For other cases, fragmentation might be important, so that between the leadership and then also the rank and file, so that the moral appeal can work. And here, the protest has agency, nonviolence, size, and representativeness. Sometimes international leverage can restrain, but again, autonomy is important. So the media, conditional aid, UN peacekeeping participation, they're not going to work for every security force, but they might work for some. And then finally, like what I just said, personal investment in institutions, level of cohesion, and gender seem to matter at the individual level. That is it. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to open up for a Q&A, I guess. first of all, thank you so much. But I get to ask the first question, and then I can stop thinking about questions. But my head is spinning. I mean, there's so many thoughts and ideas and cases in there. And this may come as no surprise to you. I was thinking of a little bit in terms of some of the earlier work that I was doing. That we were seeing that there's higher levels of abuse in units that are more fragmented. Right? And I was trying to connect this, to what you're finding with autonomy. And we were always worried that when units are fragmented, we're seeing more abuse, but also conscious in other parts of the world when there's more cohesion, you can have much more abuse, right? Because the state can then use it exactly. Mm-hmm. And so I was using this sort of framework to try and think through here. And so the question to you is: can both of your cases, types of cases, the moral and strategic, be understood in terms of the autonomy on the one hand, and kind of the disconnect between what is in the interests of the units and the interests of the government? Mm-hmm. Right. So if the government wants repression and its autonomy mightn't get it, and vice versa. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the wonderful thing about studying political science is that it's a study of trade-offs. So I think what you've just highlighted is definitely a trade-off. Cohesion is a tough one. I actually want to bring up the case of Georgia here, which I've been looking into a little bit. Because this was a case in 2003, the revolution at the time, when it was very much a case like Leipzig, where it was nonviolent, all of that stuff. And what does the security force do immediately after for the police, at least? They purge the entire police force, and they created a new, not so much cohesion in this instance, but over time, that security force develops this new police force develops this really strong attachment to the leader because he created it, and so it becomes more centralized over time and more repressive. If anybody knows what happened in 2007, and then other words. So I'm still thinking through this idea of cohesion. I present it as a positive here, but it can just as easily be adopted. You need to have a cohesive force if you're going to commit mass atrocity. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but it also, like you said, goes both ways. If you're thinking about the rebel side of things, there's also the argument that less cohesive forces are actually more violent. So it's something I'm working through. Great. But thank you for the question. Great. Yeah.
So we'll open up to questions. I think there's a mic going around. So there's a first question here on the left.
Well, thank you, Sabrina. That was marvelous. And I have a question about a variable, what might be an additional variable that was implicit, but you didn't make it explicit, which is the nature of the object that's being protested. Because in the first two cases, you used the term regime, but I'm not sure if you really meant regime so much as government. And in the third case, it's a regime. Because it's one thing to protest against a corrupt dictator, a prime minister, you just want them to get out of town. That's one issue. The other issue is when you're protesting against an entire governing structure. I don't know if that's an issue in your cases. Anyway.
Yep. No, great. Thank you. So the Honduras case was not a revolution. It was kind of, an election issue. I just wanted to bring it up because it was a hybrid regime. So it falls in the middle. But most of the cases that I'm looking at is the regime. So it's the fall of a dictator. In the surveys, we did look at this question of protest grievance. Does the grievance matter in terms of the security forces seeing the protest as more or less threatening? And the types of protests, I can say that the security forces, police and military, find the most threatening are ones about elections and ones about the security forces. They are less likely to find economic grievances or kind of social issues as threatening. But when it's about the government, and whether that's the regime or just elections, or protest of police abuse or human rights abuses, those are the ones that are most threatening.
A question here and then a question here. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think it's turned the way a lot of us think about this question on our head. So that's amazing. I'm going to ask a question about information because you mentioned it as well. You were talking about this case of moral restraint. And I love the sequencing that you put out in the case of Leipzig. I'm wondering if that would still be possible today. And if you're seeing in your data that moral restraint is actually kind of going down the drain because of the information politics.
Yeah, and information politics, you mean just the spread of information so fast, or just misinformation? Yeah. I'm trying to think of, so the recent cases like Bangladesh, Nepal, these were all instances where there was military defection, not so much the police. But there was definitely a crowd element to it too. I was trying to make a point, so I didn't go into the details of every one of these cases. I do still think protest is still a very powerful tool, but not every protest is going to be successful. So I think we can use information and digital technology to get the kind of protest that is needed to persuade the security forces, maybe not to defect, but at least to stand aside. And here there's this term called fraternization, where it's an actual protest tactic that protesters will use to give a rose to a soldier or a police officer, or try to go have peaceful dialogue with them, to try to persuade in this moral way. I think we need more of that, frankly.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question to the Leipzig situation, because, of course, there were 3 big events in the East Bloc before.
Yeah.
One should not remember it. 53, yes. 56 in Hungary, yes. And 68 in Prague.
Yes.
And those were brutal way of, not only in those countries, because the whole East Bloc was involved.
Yes.
So there was a different situation. And so my question is whether the thing which happened later in 89 could happen, because the power transformation, when Brezhnev died,
yes.
there was not really power transformation in the party there. Already was erosion in the Communist Party, which the people which came afterwards. And the same thing happens in East Germany, actually. Honecker was pushed out, and the other people really were waiting on my impression, for the phone, which from Moscow, which did not come.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, what is your opinion about these two?
This is an important point, and something that maybe didn't come out as clearly is that there has a precondition for this moral restraint idea is some weakening in the leadership. And that weakening comes because of larger political events like what you're talking about, the Soviet Union's glasnost and perestroika and these kinds of reforms. There were other reforms happening in other countries around East Germany. I don't think I haven't found a case of a pathway to this kind of large-scale restraint by the security forces in an instance where there isn't some kind of weakening that's happening first. So I think this is a very important part. We kind of have to. The bad news about this is it's kind of like you have to wait for the political conditions in the world to change to favor these kinds of strategies. I wish I had something better to say about that.
Yeah, thanks, Sabrina. That was fabulous. Is there something specific about security services as opposed to other agencies in authoritarian regimes who have not coercive powers, but the rector of a state university, the director of the state newspaper, the director of the state, who also probably does have the selective non-enforcement or selective non-compliance, maybe, and with all the same rules, independence, fragmentation, expectations the regime is about to fall, don't you really have the germs of a theory of friction within all authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I have focused on the security sector because that's my interest. But the zeros that you saw, those of you that were looking at the statistics in the figure, are those instances where there wasn't military defection, but still successful nonviolent revolution. And in those cases, the defection or the kind of standing up by civil society, by the people that you just mentioned, are what is helping to topple the regime. So this is why, the political science literature has really focused on this defection of the military. And it's true, a dictator needs coercive force to survive. But it also needs the bureaucracy, universities, these other institutions. And I think, I really think that this is something that needs to be studied. Like, what are the other core institutions that really props up the dictator, that if you take it away, or if they switch sides, what is happening in those kinds of instances? And it could be that, we're seeing that those are better for democracy, actually, in the long run, when it isn't necessarily the security forces that are defecting.
If I can ask an add-on question, abusing my position here. So, I mean, this question, some of the discussions is putting this in terms of non-compliance, but you're interested in non-compliance in a particular direction.
Yes.
In the direction of restraint. And from your talk, it sounds like you have been thinking of it in the opposite direction at first, towards more abusive or more violent, and then moved away. But that raises the question a little bit: do we not expect the same things would predict defection in both directions, or is there something particular about restraint?
Yeah, I mean, I the way that I came about wanting to study restraint was because really about this individual level data. That's kind of where it started, thinking about what makes individuals themselves kind of not use force. And later did I come to this kind of these larger cases of defection. So I like restraint better, and I think that my prediction is that it's a better concept. Maybe not as an interesting concept in political science as defection, but I think a slightly more important question in some other ways, because it's bigger than just these instances in autocracy. So I mentioned I'm hoping to look at hybrid regimes, post-conflict situations where restraint is necessary for preventing civil war, and in democracies, very key, because police restraint in particular is necessary for democratic resilience. We heard Sherry Lynn Iffel and others have written about this, that in democracies, there is massive repression still, but just of certain groups. And those certain groups are often used as testing grounds for larger repression that becomes accepted by the larger population over time. So I'm really hoping to look at repression. The U.S. is an overstudied case. Unfortunately, it's a good one because of the history and things to look at policing there and kind of differences in policing in democracies. But that's definitely part of the book. Yeah, sorry, I don't feel like I'm not answering your questions.
You are. One back here and one question back here, yes.
Thank you very much. This question might leave the scope of your study, but does discipline of the security force play an important role? Because you mentioned the success rate of nonviolent protests, and there's an asterisk to that, where as soon as someone in this nonviolent protest is going to be killed by the security force, then the success chance triples or increases tenfold at least. And do we see strategic restraint from authoritarian regimes through the police force or security force, and the discipline of that force plays a role?
Yeah. So this is another one of these things that cuts both ways. In the case of Leipzig, so I read a couple of books that really talk about the development of the Stasi and all of the internal workings of the Stasi. And in a sense, it was a very centralized, disciplined security force. In this case, that turned out to be a good thing because they didn't know what to do unless there was an order. They needed that order to act, right? So, and not having discretion was actually helped out in this, but that is usually maybe not the case. So when there's an order and there's discipline, there's going to be people that obey. So I had this figure up and then I took it out. But one of the countries that's more authoritarian in our sample of surveys, in that disobedience question, who's more likely to disobey for moral reasons, one country had 16%. 16% of our sample This is compared to like 50 or 60% in hybrid regimes and like 80% in democracies. That is coming from this idea of discipline. They're going to obey an order no matter what. And that comes from professionalism. But the problem is these things are also really important for preventing misconduct. and in fact, professionalism, I didn't show you this, but professionalism is one of the key indicators of preventing misconduct, like sexual exploitation and abuse, corruption, etc. So the problem is that it cuts both ways, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Sabrina. That was so fascinating. My question, this may be my own ignorance, but anecdotally, sort of intuitively, it seems to me that strategic restraint is really the common case. So the Egyptian military, the self-preservation of military, and that's the kind of pervasive model. And the Leipzig case, as fascinating as it is, seems so unusual because this is a geopolitical moment. So much was happening then. I'm just wondering today if you would agree. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are many other cases, or is it really pretty rare? And if that's the case, what do you do to guide the strategic restraint case in some way that you don't end up with military dictatorship or Thailand or some other?
Yeah, Leipzig, thankfully, is not the only case. So I've put Armenia, 2018. I've put Georgia, 2003, and I put Zambia, 1991, in this basket of kind of more moral restraint. I'm sure there are some other cases, but these are the ones I've kind of read more extensively about. And there's something similar in all of these cases, which is, maybe there's some other geopolitics that I haven't considered in some of the other cases. But what is definitely across the board the same is some kind of action on the part of the protesters that is calling for nonviolence, that is reaching out to the security forces, this kind of fraternization, roses or whatever, and the representativeness of the protesters. So there were, and Ukraine 2014 might fit in this case as well, where there were grandmothers at the front lines. So you make it costly. No one wants to be on TV shooting a grandmother, right? Right. So this is why there is so much agency. There is so much agency on the protest side of things. I do, however, think that there need to be certain conditions for it to be more successful. In terms of strategic restraint, I had this really long and great conversation with Scott Strauss, who was here. Oh my gosh, I think it was even last week. And I was thinking, what are some policy recommendations that come out of this? And we were thinking, well, wow, maybe the opposition needs to say like, oh, we've got the better deal for you, right? So but I don't think this is the avenue that we should go at all after kind of studying this more. I think it's just really hard because dictators, they really, they create these structures in their security forces that make these things happen. So they on purpose will create rivalries between different security forces so that there's coup-proofing, right? For example. And so when you start to favor one or the other, you've created such a messy situation that it's just so hard to remove those structures, remove the power. I mean, Egypt is such a great example of this. I'm hoping to have an answer for you by the time the book is published. So that's more helpful. But thank you. Yeah,
so we have time for just one or two more. One here in the front.
Yeah, so picking up on this point of policy recommendations, I wonder what you would say are the policy recommendations for the international community. So looking at it from an outsider perspective, how do you create conditions where strategic restraint is optimal for security forces? You talked about the case of involvement in peacekeeping forces, and that creates incentives. But are there other things like that you could point to as policy recommendations for the international community?
I do have a few ideas in maybe this in this idea of how to think about decoupling a security force in this kind of more Leipzig-like institution case where there's autonomous. I think we should save that for for outside. This is where intelligence and intelligence organizations become really important, because you really have to know how embedded and what the relative power structures are, in a place like Iran or other places. You have to have so much intelligence to really know, to be able to get it right if you're going to mess with the security forces at that level. That's all I'll say about that. I think there's a lot of policy recommendations and things to say at the individual level, which I really, really like, because this is, we can run field experiments or randomized controlled trials, and we can see, what works at that level, at least. And I do think here it's worth pointing out that professionalism, the discipline thing, trade-off aside, is really important. I do think that we should think about cohesion, both horizontal and vertical. I say this with a little bit of a caveat, because one way that horizontal cohesion amongst peers is created is actually through violence and hazing. Some of my other work shows this. So when I do these surveys and when we go in country, we make it a point to talk about positive bonding versus negative bonding. Because negative bonding, these kinds of hazing rituals, really perpetuate misconduct in the security forces and create a very hyper-masculine kind of environment. So there's a caveat. So I think we need to think about how to create more positive cohesion. I have to say this, but I think it's worth investing in diverse security forces, both in terms of gender, but also how you recruit, where you recruit from locally, ethnically, racially. I don't love saying this because it's a bit of a bandage situation, and most of my work shows that this is just it's just kind of a band-aid for the real structural problems within the security forces. But it does have some effect if we've looked at the quantitative evidence behind it. So there are some. I don't have big policy recommendations for the big structural cases, but yeah.
Thank you. And we had the last question, I think.
Thanks, Sabrina. It was a really illuminating talk. I just wanted to know whether you had more to say about the reorientation from looking for accounts of why security forces acted violently to figure out why they restrained themselves. I thought that was interesting, and I just wondered, was there more to say about the reasons for it? Was it that the data was better? Was it that you think the phenomena are more interesting? Was it that you think it's kind of the default that they'll act violently, or just what tell me about that?
About the decision to ask the question in that way. Right. Yeah. Okay. So I teach a class on political violence at Cornell. It's my big lecture class, and the very first day, we study this question of whether humans are inherently violent or not. And there's two ways to think about it. One is, if you're more pessimist, that all humans are violent and there are restraining forces. The other approach is more positive, which is that we're all peaceful and something makes us violent, right? When it comes to the security forces, there's a self-selection. This is not always the case, I think, in places where it's more of a bureaucratic or administrative job. This is going to be different. But there's been key studies in Thailand and some of my own work that shows that the people that select into policing or the military already have some tendency for authority and have some tendencies in that direction. And so, and in fact, in places that I've worked, like in Liberia and other places, police officers will tell me that had I not joined the police force, I would have joined a gang. And so we have a self-selection into the security forces of maybe people that believe a little bit more in authority or wanting authority over other people. And so this restraint question, I think, becomes more of an interesting question in that population of people. So that's kind of why.
And it's a great but very depressing note to end on human nature. And but we've touched on many themes, and what I appreciated this discussion also pointed to a lot of Sabrina's other work that wasn't so present in the talk, but is just fascinating and rich. And so, thank you, Sabrina Karim.
Thank you.